this conversation today with my esteemed panelists. So what I'm going to be doing here is to just take a few minutes to tee up our discussion, and then I will introduce my panelists, and what I'm hoping for is a really nice moderated debate in the next hour, and then we're going to leave 15 minutes at the end for questions from our audience. I think they can submit their questions through the chat box. At the end of the hour, I'll go through those questions and pose those questions to our panelists. Let me see if I can move my slides. Yes, okay. So I don't think this crowd needs this reminder or the statement, but I'll do it anyway to just emphasize the importance of this conversation we're having today. Transportation electrification is absolutely key for meeting decarbonization goals. And this is because transportation sector generates the largest share of greenhouse gas emissions at about 28%. And it is essential to address for meeting clean energy goals, 80 by 50s and net zero goals that most of the states, cities, utilities have been setting for themselves for the past couple of years. So out of the 20% that is attributed to transportation sector, about 50% or so is coming from the vehicles. And granted, those vehicles include passenger cars and fleets and medium and heavy duty vehicles. My sort of discussion today mostly focuses on the passenger vehicles, but again, I think we're at the cusp of a really important change which will affect both the passenger vehicles as well as fleets and higher duty vehicles. So based on Bloomberg New Energy Finance's to 2020 EV outlook, the US EV passenger sales represent less than 2% of the market share as of 2020. So when you take this number and compare it to other leading economies, to Europe, Europe is at 5% as of 2020, and China is a little over 7% in 2020. So, and then this difference, the difference in the market share seems to widen at least through 2025. But once the parity is reached between ICE vehicles and the EVs, that gap, and I think with the help of some policy initiatives, starts to narrow through 2030. But these charts basically, and the lines, the discrepancy between US and other economies shows that we're still at a very sort of early stages of transportation electrification, and we have lots to do to move to those higher market shares and more prevalent EVs on the roads. And you will remember this chart because Mike had this in his presentation a few minutes ago. We like to show this chart because it really presents the picture clearly that there is a huge uncertainty around how many EVs we can expect to see on our roads in the next decade. Those forecasts range from 10 million EVs on the road to 35 million EVs on the road. Again, very wide range, and all the planners know that good forecasts are key for planning, and that with such a wide range, it becomes exceedingly difficult for, again, utilities, ISOs and RTOs to really plan for this wave of electrification. And I think also to just complicate things a bit more, in most states, EV goals or targets are mostly aspirational. That you could look up the state objectives for a given state, and it says X many cars on the road by 2030, or there are ZEV goals, X many cars on the roads by 2025. But it really doesn't say much about how to get there. And also these bottom-up fundamentals driven forecasts are not widely available at the time. So we're kind of trying to plan in the dark when it comes to transportation electrification. disciplining in the dark because we don't necessarily know which levers to pull to impact EV adoption levels. We don't know whether we should spend money on giving people rebates. We should extend tax credits. We should extend high occupancy vehicle exemption lanes, or we should really focus on increasing the charging infrastructure and make it readily available. So we know that all of these factors affect. We don't necessarily understand well which levers will lead to the biggest impact. So to kind of help put some light on this big question, we developed an econometric EV adoption model, and we recently forecasted EV sales for utility through 2040. And in that study, we found that increased charging infrastructure deployments and reduced range anxiety explained 1/4 of the market share as of 2030 and beyond. So this basically confirms the idea that reduced range anxiety, addressing range anxiety is really key for increasing EV adoption, and the goal would be to make charging infrastructure ubiquitous across the US, and that's obviously easier said than done. So today we're really going to focus on answering the question of how to unstuck the US EV market from the stagnant growth mode that it is in. Granted, current levels of EV adoption could not have been reached without the coordination and partnership among many key stakeholders, such as electric utilities, environmental organizations, charging companies, regulators. So there's a lot of coordination that goes into what we currently have, but we need a lot more of that going forward. And because we're talking about 20-30 million EVs on the road as of 2030, so if there's any chance of those targets to materialize, we really need to focus heavily on our infrastructure investments. And today, this panel, we represent two key stakeholders and important players in this debate. We have two presenters from electric utilities, and we have two presenters from charging infrastructure companies. So we will really hear from them in the next hour, their perspectives and how they're paving the path forward to help drive EV adoption and integrate EVs to our broader grid seamlessly. So yeah, let me introduce my panelists here, and now we'll jump right into the discussion. Robert Barossa is Senior Director, Sales, Business Development and Marketing at Electrify America. In this role, Robert leads business and infrastructure development, product planning, business partnerships, marketing, and e-commerce. Prior to Electrify America, Robert served as Vice President of OEM Strategy and Business Development for EV TOU. Our second panelist is Devesh Gupta. Devesh currently serves as Director of Strategy for BG's Utility of the Future efforts. Devesh's team develops and implements innovative next steps for BG's customers, from EV infrastructure to community solar, storage, and more. Previously, Devesh led the Energy Solutions team for Constellation and served as Chief of Staff for the President of Constellation Retail. And before joining the retail business, he was an attorney for Exxon Corp. It's always great to have an attorney in webinars like this. Our third speaker is Anthony Harrison. Anthony is Head of Utility Partnerships, North America at ChargePoint. Anthony specializes in providing government and regulatory affairs strategy support to private companies, investment firms, and trade associations. His areas of expertise include renewable energy, clean transportation, electric utilities, project finance, and sustainable development. Anthony is a certified lead accredited professional. And last but not least, our fourth panelist is Eamon Yuri. Eamon is a product development manager at Salt River Project. Eamon currently manages demand response programs for residential and business customers at SRP and expanding SRP's EV managed charging programs. Eamon previously worked at Apple, managing interconnection programs, and he also has 19 years of service in the United States Army Reserve. And Eamon is also getting his first COVID shot today. and he was scheduled at very early in the morning. So he may be running a little late to the panel, but he will definitely make it, hopefully in the next 30 minutes. So with that, I really want to dive right into our panel. And I want to ask each of my panelists to take 5 minutes to tell us about their current initiatives in their organizations to advance charging infrastructure investments and manage or help manage the impact of EV load on system peaks and grid reliability. Again, just 5 minutes, and I was hoping that we could get started with Devesh, Robert, Anthony, and now we could go to Eamon. And let me see, I think Devesh, you would want your slides here, correct?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can go ahead and get started. First,
Okay.
excited to be here, and thanks a lot for this opportunity. I'm looking forward to hearing more and learning from the other panelists here as well. So thanks for putting it together. So just to talk a little bit about Baltimore Gas and Electric and our programs that we're proud of, and really are in the midst of at the moment. So back in January of 2019, the Maryland Public Service Commission approved a settlement that we had reached with a number of parties, including some of the parties here on the phone. I know ChargePoint was involved in some of those discussions for sure, in order to get the utilities into the business of encouraging customers to begin to electrify their transportation, get into the infrastructure business a little bit as well. We really launched those programs on July 1st of 2019, kind of in earnest. But it takes some time after that to ramp them up too. Just a real quick snapshot of some of the things that we have been implementing. One, they let us start to issue residential rebates for customers to install level 2 smart charging in their homes. So we offer a $300 flat rebate for customers to install that charging. We also have begun to allow customers to give us permission to access their Tesla telematics if they have installed level 2 charging at home as well. Pairing those two together to us makes them smart. So you're eligible for the rebate if you can do that as well. We have non-residential rebates, so rebates for multi-unit dwelling customers up to $25,000 per site, $5,000 per level 2 port, and I think it's $10,000 or $15,000 per DCFC port. And then our own infrastructure, and I know that's a lot of what we're talking about here today. We were given permission to begin to develop, own, and operate 500 charging stations across central Maryland that had to be available for public use 24/7 and had to be located on government-owned or controlled property, so a little bit different. There was a focus placed on us to make sure that we were looking at places where maybe some of the private companies weren't going at that time, so focus more on infill, on communities that were maybe a little underrepresented when it came to charging and things of that sort. So try to do that. Certainly focus on those governmental locations, not so much the backbone infrastructure for commuters necessarily. And then a variety of other programs, including a time of use rate that we're really excited about. It's an EV only time of use rate. We think it's maybe the only one of its kind so far in the country that allows us to bill customers this time of use rate only for their EV charging without setting a second meter. How do we do that? We leverage data from those smart chargers that customers have at home or from their vehicle telematics and actually bill them a time of use rate based on the charging data that we're getting from their Teslas directly. And then there are a number of DOE funded programs. These are programs we applied for early last year that are more community oriented. One is the managed charging program. We're still developing the scope for that program, but we have been awarded a grant for that. Excited about that because it's going to allow us to try some managed charging applications that weren't approved in our Maryland Public Service Commission order. So not putting ratepayer dollars at risk, but trying some things that really allow us to prepare for that future for the grid. And then the one that I'm probably a little more excited about is our EV rideshare program. We'll be working with a platform company, a TNC company, to introduce 100 electric vehicles into the greater Baltimore, Washington area that are focused on rideshare. And for us, that's important. One, we're going to try to focus those efforts on limited income communities in and around Baltimore. And then two, it's going to give a lot of impressions on electric vehicles. When you think about 100 electric vehicles that are on the road, maybe they're giving at least 20 rides a week for 52 weeks of the year. You're talking about potentially more than 100,000 impressions, 100,000 ride and drives every year, just for people sitting in those vehicles as passengers, and that can be very powerful. We certainly have educational materials too. You can go to our website to find out more. Excited to talk a little bit more about these programs as we walk through the questions.
Great, thanks, Devesh. So Robert, do you mind telling us a bit about your initiatives at Electrify
Sure.
America?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you very much for having me. For those of you who may not know Electrify America, we're one of the largest or the largest ultra-fast charging public network across the United States now. We're only 3 years old, so the scale and speed of our deployment is sort of unprecedented. I think what's unique about us is that we're an owner operator, so we site the location of the stations, lease the land, develop, design, construct, own, and operate that station and provide services to customers on those stations. So we have about 500 stations across the country today. If you look at our map, there's several routes across the country, east to west and several north to south. We're in all the major metro markets too, developing in the cities as well as all the regional and highway routes. Those 500 stations translates to somewhere around 2,500 chargers actually in the field. And these chargers are ultra fast. So, you know, we've normally, when we talk about DC fast charging, you know, for a lot of years, we talked about 25 and 50 kilowatt chargers. So when we decided to start our deployment, we really looked at where's the market going? Where are automakers taking their vehicles in terms of speed and capability? What do consumers want in terms of refill times when they need to charge? And what do they expect? So when we deployed our stations, we looked to start at a minimum of 150 kilowatts and actually have gone up to 350 kilowatts. So most of our stations, when you go to them, you'll find a mix of 150 and 350 kilowatts. And that means, you know, a customer can recharge, you know, 300 miles, 200 miles of range in that 15 to 25 minute time frame, which is a big game changer and gets consumers closer to what they feel today when they're refueling their ICE vehicles. Those 500 stations, like I said, are across the country. So we worked with, you know, well over 200 utilities, IOUs, munis, co-ops. So you can imagine how fun and exciting that was in our deployment, and really, you know, learning how each of these different entities work. You know, they're all at sort of different, I would say, levels of education and in terms of progress, in terms of how they're embracing electrification. So it's been a lot of fun going through the process of educating, working with them to improve processes and things like that. We like to talk a lot about our hardware and what we're deploying, but we also have a big effort around education and awareness, and really helping drive awareness to electric vehicles that they are normal and they're normal now, and people can make the switch now. So we have a big campaign called our Normal Now campaign. You can go to normalnow.com and find a lot of information about infrastructure, about vehicles, incentives, and all sorts of other things, and really trying to bring that awareness to consumers, trying to fill the top of the funnel, right? Get them into the consideration phase as they're thinking about their next vehicle. And then along with that, what we do is we also do a lot of sponsorships and other activities for local community efforts around, you know, ride and drives, especially in California. We've done quite a few of those. We've launched several STEM efforts to really teach, you know, electrification to the younger generation and get them excited about the movement and really build that momentum, right? So as we go into 2025 and 2030 and 2035, right, it's natural for everyone to think electric. So one of the other things we do, because part of your question is, you know, how do we are putting out this large infrastructure, 150 kilowatt, 350 kilowatt infrastructure, and every time you go to our station, we don't power share. So, you know, if 5 cars show up and they all want 150 kilowatts, we're going to deliver 150 kilowatts. We're going to deliver that experience that they're expecting. but that also puts a a tremendous amount of burden on the grid, as well as costs from demand charges and things like that. So one of the things we're doing alongside that charger deployment is actually installing quite a few battery storage systems where it makes sense. So today we're deploying about 120, and then throughout this year and next year we'll continue to expand that, and that's really to help minimize the impact on the grid, but ultimately, more for a financial reason, to help lower the overall expense and operation of these charging stations. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Anthony, can we hear from you?
Yes, thank you so much, Sanem, and I'm really excited for the panel today, the general topic area. So I lead our utility partnerships team here at ChargePoint, and ChargePoint is a leading provider that designs and delivers integrated networked EV charging technology solutions for all types of driving applications. So whether you're charging at home, at work, around town, or as we're increasingly seeing, charging your electric fleet, we match our technology solutions with those charging applications. And I would say that one of the core pieces from the 12 years experience that we have on this is understanding the deep connectivity between enabling electrification of the transportation sector with managing grid impacts. That's from the heart and soul of what our company was and what we've done from the beginning. If you look at even originally our patents, we understood that being able to manage load, being able to have a network intelligent smart charging solution was going to be the key to really seeing widespread adoption of transportation electrification. And so with that, whether it's managing the charging application with a homeowner, aligning it with rates from utilities like we heard BGE and Devesh is doing, we're seeing those kind of innovative rate designs, innovative different price signals that EV charging solutions can align with, whether it's that or how to manage it at a workplace or increasingly, like I said, how to manage it at a fleet. We work with our customers to enable that from the site level, and then we work with utilities on their side around the programs that they're offering. And I think that one of the things that's been really interesting, I will just touch on over the last 12 months or so, is that even with the change in all of our lives and the work differences we've had given the impact of COVID, in a ways, it's actually highlighted the benefits of having this type of technology rolled out into the market, because as we've seen more people shift from potentially charging at work to charging at home, they have the solutions in place to still be able to take advantage of options from their electric utility. And so just even over the last 12 months, we've launched demand response enabled programs with several of our utility partners to take advantage of the home charging network solutions and look at what could essentially be a roadmap for how, once we see this increasing scale of EV charging across everywhere, what are the right tools and capabilities to help manage that load on the grid. And so some of the key things that I will that I would just point to is I think that from the driver experience side, making this as easy as possible. So one of the things that we try to do as we work with utilities on designing their customer programs is understanding that the primary purpose of charging for everybody is to refuel. That's what they're doing. They're trying to fill up their car. They don't think of it as I'm connecting this battery to the grid for the purposes of managing my energy. They're literally just trying to refuel. So as much as we can make that process as easily as possible, and so one of the key features of, if I take our homeowner example, is being able for them to plug in what we call set and forget, for our mobile app to enable them to automate their charging schedule alongside their utility rate, and then be able to provide data on the back end in a secure way to the utilities for their purposes, enables a seamless charging experience. And we think that that's key across the board as we think about any of these sectors. If you look at the fleet sector, where this becomes a business and operational cornerstone for them to succeed, is making a seamless charging experience as possible. And so having these tools on the back end to help them automate and align their charging schedules with different price signals from the utility is a key focus. So I think that we see a lot more opportunities coming from as utilities look at increasing their investments they're making through their customer programs, and we look at just the rapid growth across all sectors, not just the passenger vehicle sector, but again in fleets and other sectors. I think that we see a lot of continued growth and taking advantage of the large network we have with technology-enabled solutions.
Great, thank you so much, Anthony. I believe Eamon is on.
Yes, I am.
Great. Eamon,
Well,
the floor is yours.
good morning. So here at SRP, we are a large electric utility in the Phoenix metro area. We offer water, power, and some telecommunications support to our residential and business customers. So for electric vehicles and our electric transportation grid goals by 2035, we are supporting the enablement of up to 500,000 electric vehicles in SRP's service territory, with the hopes of managing 90% of the EV charging load through price plans, dispatchable load management, and original equipment manufacturer integration, in addition to connected smart homes and behavioral and other emerging programs. Currently, we offer a residential EV charging rebate of $250 towards the rebate of a level 2 smart charger. So that's through our marketplace and through other available rebate options that the customers are going to be having rolled out to them. We also have an even larger EV business charging rebate where we provide $1,500 towards a networked EV charging port installed at a customer's business. So that's quite a large rebate towards a smart charger out there. It's one of the largest, I think, in the industry at this point, which is quite nice. We also offer an EV TU rate that's available to any customer residentially. We don't have any limits to that, so right now we're not going to go on cap enrollment for those EV TOU rates for residential customers. Customers can lower their energy cost by charging their vehicle at super off-peak hours between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. And so customers who switch from our basic price plan to the EV price plan can save an average of 9% using energy during off-peak hours. We're also currently working to create a managed EV charging pilot program through both EV vehicle telematics and an EVSC-based managed charging approach. And we're also looking to implement an EV rebate program on new EV vehicles purchased in our service territory. So currently, SRP has quite a few programs offered for the EV charging and EV charging integration.
Thank you so much, Eamon. It sounds like everybody's hands are really full, and we're on a good track to making progress and laying the foundations for more EVs to be charged and connect to the grid. So that brings me to my second question, which is, we saw the chart with a wide range for EV forecasts on the road, ranging between 10 million to 35 million by 2030. I want to ask my panelists and see how optimistic are you all in terms of EV adoption gaining real traction in the US in the very short term, in the next couple of years, as well as through 2030. And I also would like to hear what are the top 3 barriers that you think are preventing us from getting to those increased adoption levels, and what might be your proposed solutions to these barriers. I know it's a very loaded question, but hopefully, given the experts you are, you'll be able to cover it in the mere minutes that you have. So this time, I would like to start with Robert, go to Devesh, Eamon, and Anthony, please.
Sure. So in terms of my optimism, obviously I'm in this space. I'm extremely optimistic that we're headed in the right direction, and this has got real legs. And obviously, I think over the last 10 years we've seen growth just continue to happen. And now with I think you see all the SPACs and the investor interest happening in the space. So it's not only just me, but other investors now are joining in and really getting serious about some large investments in the space, which is great to see. And it really will bring a lot of momentum and forward velocity to the movement. You know, I think it all starts with the product, right? We need the cars. I think, you know, there's been sort of limited models for the last few years, and the OEMs have been spending billions of dollars in terms of the development of the vehicles, and so we see that coming now, and I think that's really exciting with the launch of the ID4, the Audi e-tron, and the Mach-E, several just models coming out all over the place, and not just compliance vehicles anymore, right? So now we're starting to see mass market vehicles that are going to go on a 50-state strategy, if not a worldwide strategy. So the vehicles are coming. It's going to take some time, right, to get them to evolve in more and more models. But the velocity we see in terms of those product introductions, it all starts there. The next big barrier that we feel we've been focusing on, like I talked about before, is having the right type of charging infrastructure. And it's really, how do you drive that confidence in the consumer to make the switch, right? Because as soon as you think about EVs, you think about, okay, well, how am I going to charge this car? Can I go from Los Angeles to Vegas in the car? Can I go camping with my family that's 5 hours away? Can I make it to those destination locations? Those are the types of questions consumers are asking themselves, and so they want to be assured that they have that confidence. And I think Tesla is a great model. What we've seen, what they did with their supercharge network, it sort of was kind of the linchpin that made that vehicle, on top of the other great things they did with the car, but it's a big component of why people are buying that vehicle or getting into that vehicle. So having that right type of, fast charging infrastructure to get you wherever you want to go, changes the consumer psyche and gets people into that vehicle. The next, and kind of along those lines, we need to make sure that there's access for everyone. I think that's extremely important. Dinesh kind of pointed on, kind of what they're doing in their program, looking at areas where markets are not being served and putting infrastructure in that space so that charging is ubiquitous, because there is a significant portion of the consumer market that doesn't have access to home charging, doesn't have access to workplace charging. Is very mobile, rents and things like that. So we need to make sure that there is charging for those types of customers, and at a rate that is comparable to that as residential, at least as we see it. So rates is a big barrier, especially in the early days as we grow this market. Demand charges don't really it's not a good model for a load factor DC fast charging station. So we need that type of infrastructure to drive the confidence, but the overall rate structure and the cost structure to operate those stations, they're not in line. We're starting to see really good movement. We've seen some things in California, some things in New York and other states where utilities are moving in the right direction, trying to grow with the market, lower the demand, put it more to variable, and those sorts of things that I think are very helpful. But certainly we need to do more work that area across the country.
Great, thank you. Dinesh?
Thanks, Senan. I think Robert's spot on in a number of ways. And first, the optimism, and we probably wouldn't be in this discussion if we weren't optimistic about where things were going. And honestly, some of that optimism is, I think, the potential both upholding and maybe even expanding federal incentives. I think that's part of the driving part of my optimism. And then fleets. We're hearing so much about fleets. That's going to make such an impact on both the auto manufacturers as well as consumers that are seeing them out there. This is a part of their lives. It's going to drive infrastructure too. So when I think about the three challenges, again, products, number one, you're going to hear here, right? And it's a diversity of products. It's products from many different manufacturers, brands that everyday consumers trust, not just those that are very tech savvy. It's going to be small vehicles, pickup trucks, everything in between. Obviously, in America and much of the world, SUVs, right? So we need to have those. And then product pricing is the second for me, right? And Robert touched on this too, and this is when it comes to that equity side of it, that equitable access. We need to have lower price vehicles, entry-level vehicles that have a good amount of range to meet people's needs. And so we need to see more products, better pricing, and then finally, again, he talked about this charging infrastructure. BGE, I think in the last year, we've made really good progress on our network. We energized our 100th charger maybe a week or so ago, and we were excited about that within a year. 500 chargers, even though our L2s are dual port chargers, so it's going to account for a lot more charging ports, not nearly enough to give customers that comfort, to give them the access that they need. Electrify America, ChargePoint, others have been very active in Maryland, for instance. We need to continue that effort in order to get those points of charging out there. We're certainly not there yet.
Thank you. Eamon?
So in the same way that Robert and Devesh are very optimistic, we are the same way. So as I stated before, we see being able to support at least 500,000 EVs in our service territory. That can possibly even be increasing. And if you look at our neighboring states adopting ZEV mandates by 2035, that'll further drive more and more innovation, larger battery capacities, other alternative means of charging as well, larger infrastructure, as they talked about, coming from possibly some federal grants and also some state infrastructure. One of the great parts about SRP is that we have a tremendous amount of land available to us that we already own, so we can kind of free up some of that space and some of those other areas to be able to go and help that charging infrastructure along the roadways, along the highways, be able to provide that. We have extremely reliable power as well. So given those factors, we see so much growth in there. You've got more and more vehicles, as previously stated, right? You have manufacturers like Rivian coming online where they're going to provide Amazon delivery vans. There's talks of bus models coming available to even utility vehicles, with Ford releasing their EF-150 potentially coming out here in the next year or so. So you're going to see that adopted, all the way from construction trucks that use pickups to some of our utility vehicles that go out and service our customers. More and more vehicles. And I think one of the big things too is the larger and larger battery packs. As the battery technology continues to increase, you're going to have more range on these vehicles, but also you're going to have that need for more and more advanced charging infrastructure, right? So where we saw years ago level 1 chargers, but now all these level 2 chargers coming around with all the DC fast charging. So with that, kind of the sky's the limit a little bit. You're going to see that price parity that kind of got hinted at. So as that product price parity for ICE vehicles comes into play, right? If the average consumer price vehicle is somewhere around $42,600 for an ICE vehicle, you're seeing that now come about, and even potentially even lower with EVs. So as that comes about, and of course the coronavirus has done a number of changes across the country in numerous ways, you may see some of those concerns about range anxiety go away from customers because they don't necessarily need to drive as much. So as the range also increases, more and more availability. So now is the opportunity where we are actually seeing a larger percentage of EVs being bought in our service territory. So we continue to see that continue to grow and grow and grow from here. So go back to Sanam and Anthony.
Great, thank you, Eamon.
So I will just add on. I think that what everyone has said here, I think captured a lot of the different optimism and momentum we're seeing across the industry. And I will go above and beyond and say, not just is it really exciting, as from the ChargePoint perspective, as a company that started before the Nissan Leaf was even released in the US market, right? So I think we're inherently optimistic in our DNA about the future of this, but what we're seeing now from not just the vehicle availability that we have currently, but the commitments to electrification that the major automakers are making, right? So you have GM rebranding almost their entire company around this. You have a lot of European and Asian automakers that are saying that they're fully committed to electrifying their entire vehicle availability. And that's just on the passenger vehicle side. It's been said here, you're seeing these huge commitments from the fleet, medium, heavy duty, transit sector, and you combine those with an increase in state and local programs, new federal excitement around where this is going. I think that all signs are pointing to, I think, really increasing the adoption at a rate we haven't seen before. And I think it's just, even from our own experience, from an infrastructure deployment side what we were doing, annually just a few years ago, or how many ports we're seeing deployed across our network each month. And so this is really picking up pace. And to bring it to the core of the panel, one of the other really exciting things we're seeing is the engagement from utilities all across the country. This is not anymore just a California or some of the other states that were doing it from obviously a climate and sustainability perspective, but we're seeing utilities across the country. We're talking to them every day. We're seeing programs launch. They're making investments, and they're supporting the market in markets where the EV deployment doesn't look anything like where it does in other places, but we know it's there, and we know that it's being enabled at a rate we haven't seen before. And I think some of the things as we look forward, what we need to do to help support and unlock this piece, whether you want to call it a challenge or an opportunity, I think that looking specifically at the core of what this is going to mean to both consumers and to fleet adopters, which is they're going to be looking at electricity as a fuel in a way that they've never had to before. So that price of that fuel and what it means in order to manage your charging around it, I think is going to be a key piece. As was already said, we've got utilities already innovating around that, offering up time of use rates, looking at different ways for rate design that's outside of the traditional commercial demand charge structure, looking at different ways to send the price signal to make sure we're minimizing the impacts, but while also aligning with the understanding that this is transportation as a fuel. And I think that's going to be really key. I think the other area that we really need to scale on, and it's starting to happen, but is that there's been a ton of focus, which we appreciate being a charging station manufacturer and company, on the actual charging station itself. But I think from the utility sector perspective, looking upstream, looking at everything that can happen from the distribution side that needs to be ready, because where I think we see the inflection point around this is when Amazon wants to put in megawatts of charging in order to electrify their entire fleet, and the timing to be able to do that, the upstream distribution investments, right? So one of the things that we do alongside of working with utilities is educating utility regulators and policymakers and decision makers around not just the opportunity, but the timing and the speed and the scale that needs to happen to enable this, because that's where I think that we're going to see success in the short and long term, is being able to make a pathway where there is a turnkey way to commercialize infrastructure. And I think some of the examples we're already seeing out of places like Colorado, Oregon, and California, where it's not just customer incentive programs, but utilities are being enabled to create standard distribution side make-ready tariffs. These kind of ideas are, I think, key to really helping to standardize the deployment and make it really seamless from the infrastructure side of how we're scaling this. So I think those are really the key areas that I would identify. And then I think moving forward, further taking advantage of the capabilities of smart charging, to a degree that goes beyond just the data or being able to shift load off peak, but looking at really exciting opportunities to actively manage grid resources using the electric vehicles is another exciting area.
No, thank you for that. I mean, sounds like there's a great consensus on the role of OEM commitment to transportation electrification, the importance of coordination between electric utilities and private infrastructure companies, role of incentives, getting customers educated. Those are all the things that are definitely, we're all working very hard to address, but need to be doing more in the next couple of years and beyond. So, I mean, this is one of those questions or problems that I like to call as like all hands on deck type of a question to be solved. And this is clearly represented in your respective remarks, what you're doing in this ecosystem from your vantage point. But I would like to sort of more explicitly and clearly ask, do you think there is sufficient coordination and communication between electric utilities and private market participants to advance the state of transportation electrification. Because if you look back 5 years, I think at the beginning this was more of a who's going to lead this, or there was this bigger emphasis on the competition. Utilities, you step aside, private market will do this, and utilities were no, we've been delivering service and electricity for years, we are a key player. My perception is that we've moved beyond those confrontational debates. We are in a more collaborative stage at the transportation electrification debate. But I would like to hear your perspectives. Are we doing enough to facilitate that coordination and communication? And what can be done to improve the coordination? And what are the best roles for utilities and charging companies to drive transportation electrification and infrastructure investments? Again, another loaded question. I would like to start with Eamon, go to Anthony, Robert, and Devesh, please.
So thank you very much for the question. Overall, I think managed EV charging is likely to be the biggest area of advance on the distribution side. So I think part of what we're going to see is we're going to have more and more vehicles coming onto the system, even with our enablement to bring on more and more chargers. I think really managing that charge and helping on the distribution side with that charge, that smarter distribution system to fuel all the EVs is going to be one of the biggest areas of coordination that's really going to need to happen. So it's going to need to happen obviously through the charging companies. That's going to need to happen through the vehicle OEM. So it's going to need to happen through some government regulation to be able to forecast friendly regulation, but also at the same time to provide some standards, right? So some of the standards is out there. I think everybody can agree that, you have different modalities and different plugs and several different areas of improvement that probably could come along. So some of it is standardization. That's probably what I would like to see from a regulation standpoint. But when it comes to overall, I think it's going to just be that managed EV charging, whether, like I said, through vehicle telematics. And I think that's a big one on the OEM side from the manufacturers, is hopefully have some open commitments from them to say, hey, we will allow vehicle telematics and keep them open, so that way some of the private companies that are on this call here can continue to innovate with that, right? If we had the vehicle manufacturers close down those avenues, I think that's really going to hurt us, because that doesn't get us to our number one goal, right? I think everybody on this call, we all want to make the customer happy that's driving an EV, whether it's a residential customer, a business customer, a commercial customer, or a municipality, right? They want to be able to have that charge. So whatever their state of charge is, I think that's a big portion. So being able to have that open architecture, knowing the state of charge, and then that way we as the utility can help obviously fuel that vehicle up by that time of the morning when they need to go to work, or they need to go and take your mom to the hospital or the airport or what have you. You want to be able to do that, right? So making sure that that open architecture is there, allowing increased innovation to drive more and more investment into there, because you're going to see so much innovation out of there. I mean, look at the way that cloud computing is done now. If you would have looked at it 10 years ago, everybody kind of would have been like, oh, that's a pie in the sky idea. But now it's there. It's completely something that we do all the time. It's what we rely on. It's the same kind of thing. You're going to want to see this sort of open architecture to be able to make this happen for the future. And that's sort of where I see that need to continue to be coordinated through the OEMs, through the some federal regulation, state regulation as well.
Great, thank you. Anthony?
Yeah, going back to something that you said, I do think that there has been a lot of growth and a lot of increased collaboration between the private sector, whether it's the charging companies, the vehicle OEMs, and the utilities themselves over the last decade. And I think that a lot of the early learnings and some of even the kind of the early sharpening of elbows was really around, in a lot of ways, educating the regulators, because it was enabling the utilities to be allowed to make these investments that coincide with supporting a competitive private market. And we've seen all over the U.S. The examples of that happening, right? So we know, and it's a proven model that ChargePoint has partnerships with utilities all over the country to successfully do what each other does best, to leverage the expertise and the benefits of both to do this. And so whether it's, again, through customer programs where we've got tight coordination with the utilities, really putting in place the right program requirements to make sure that the infrastructure that's being deployed is used and useful and going to be able to provide benefits to both the drivers and the grid. That's a huge piece, and I think we're continuing to see that. It was just touched upon by Eamon, I think, as well. And then I think the other area where we see coordination is at a broader policy level. ChargePoint was one of the founding members last year of Zeta, which is a national trade association made up of private sector charging companies, automakers, and utilities, where we're really locking arms. And now I think with the new federal administration kind of paving the way, I think that we're going to see a lot more national collaboration across the sector in a way that we haven't seen before across those three industries, the vehicle manufacturers, the charging providers, and the utilities, around what's really going to be needed to help this scale and to inform policymakers around the right regulations and the right standards to set in place that leverages everything. But I would say it's more than trending in the right direction. We're proving that collaboration is there, and we always like increase in our partnerships and the work that we're doing with utilities, of course, because that helps both businesses grow. But I think that we've really got a great roadmap ahead of us on working together.
Excellent. Robert? You're muted.
That works, right? Like I mentioned before, we've dealt with over 200 utilities across the country, and have experienced different levels of education and processes and other things that has made the rollout easy in some places and very difficult in others. So it's a very when you look at the utility space, it's very fragmented, right? I live in Los Angeles, while Southern California Edison is the largest utility here. You have LA DWP, you have Burbank, Azusa, Pasadena, Anaheim. So there's a lot of different munis and others, and not all of them have the same sort of process, procedures, staff, priorities in that sense to around transportation electrification. So one of the things we've really tried to do is bring best practices that have worked in some utilities and try to bring those to utilities that maybe are trying to figure it out still and trying to see how they should help and coordinate activities within their own organization. So a lot of those have been actually getting a point person to handle specific infrastructure investments and things that are happening in their territory to help streamline the process within their own organization and bring those to fruition sooner than later. We've worked with some of the larger utilities to see how they can prioritize not only from the design standpoint, but how they can prioritize and staff up from a construction standpoint, right? Laying out all this distribution to be able to bring a megawatt worth of power or 2 megawatts worth of power to a particular site takes a lot of work. And so you have to balance that with all the other work going on in the service territory. So being able to coordinate with them to show them a roadmap of here's our investment plan over the next 3 years and 5 years, here's what we're bringing to the table, and then allowing them to better plan, right, their service organizations to be able to meet that need that we have, and then taking that inputs from the other folks that are making the investments helps them then plan better. So that coordination, that discussion around future plans, what's coming down the road, and making sure that as private investors that we're bringing that information to the utilities so that they can push that up their leadership chain and regulators and other things to help staff up appropriately and meet the need. So that's been a big one, just that overall sharing and collaboration, and it's gotten much better over the last 3 years. And we've seen this, as we go into smaller territories, the willingness to listen and be able to implement some of these ideas has been great. And then just to touch on a little bit on the rate policy making, I think that's the next big one. I always touch back to rates, talk about demand charges all the time. But these things are especially important in these early years to make sure that these investments that are happening stay viable and continue to be viable, whether it's ours or others, and help others get into the space, right? And make that investment. So making sure we have the right rates in place to support the infrastructure and the investments that are being made, especially in these early years. And then once the market does pick up, then things can change and we're able to support different structures. So that's another key piece for us.
Right. And before moving to Devesh, just a quick question there for you, Robert. Mm-hmm. Since you brought up the rates are one of my favorite subjects. So yes, demand charges is really the big elephant in the room. But then if you look at it from the utility perspective, they have rate design objectives. And one of those objectives is that rates should be cost reflective and it should minimize cross subsidies across different customer classes. And yes, these emissions benefits all the non-participants, but do you guys have a solution to this demand charge dilemma and how to make pricing more friendly for the charging companies, but at the same time mitigate utility concerns?
Yeah, so I think generally, you got to look at rate policy, the time frame around your rate policy making. So, looking at a 10 to 15 year time horizon, so that there is sufficient time to be able to recoup maybe some early losses or things that are being done in the early years. But at a certain point, there's a certain whether it's policy being driven down through the states or the local jurisdictions, whatever they may be, right? There's a sense of we have to move to electrification, and for that we need to be able to incentivize, whether it's through rates or however the incentive, whether it's a make ready, whatever it is, dollars have to come in to help subsidize this in some sense in the early years so that it will take hold and move forward. So, to a certain degree, there is a policy decision that needs to be made that's saying this is an area we're going to invest in, and there may be some cross subsidization that happens maybe in the early years, and there's more along that time horizon to be able to recruit that cross subsidization. But ultimately, what we're talking about here is delivering a huge amount of kilowatt hours into the system. And for a system that's seen sort of a flattening or decline of kilowatt hour usage overall over the last decade. So it's gonna lift all boats eventually, but we have to get to that point.
Yeah, no, sounds like you're calling for a lot of creativity in rate design, which has been the strong point of the utility sector as well as the regulators. So hopefully we'll see more progress there in the next several years. So Devesh, in addition to the question that I've asked to the panel, I also want to add on one more for you, which is, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your secret sauce for getting your commission approve your infrastructure investment plan. I feel like you've done at PG a great progress with being able to get approvals for these investments compared to some other jurisdictions. So any lessons learned from that experience?
Yeah, and I think those questions actually flow together really well, because one of the first question you asked was how's communication and coordination, and part of the reason we've been able to be successful in Maryland is because we did have so much communication and coordination when it came to the proposal phase for these, right? We were in working groups listening to where everyone was coming from and trying to come to a consensus to put as much of a consensus as we could before the commission for an EV policy, right, in terms of what we were doing. That made it much easier for the commission to say, yeah, go for it. And sure, they pared down a lot of what we proposed as a broad coalition, but they felt a whole lot more comfortable making that decision. And it's something every time we go back to the commission right now, one of the questions we get to ask is, have you talked to the stakeholders? What do they think about these things? And so that communication was key. And so we've been doing a good job of that. And at the same time, as Robert and Anthony both are pointing out, we've got to do a better job, right? That we do have to have those conversations about what does your roadmap look like, Electrify America, for the next 5 years, 10 years, so that we can move more swiftly to be able to support that so that they can get to market. And so it's a yes and a no in terms of how we've been doing. And that question about the commission, one, it's the stakeholders having all that communication ahead of time, planning in advance. And then two, some of it's luck of the draw, right? We have a commission in Maryland that very much sees where the future needs to go. We have a state that has set a goal of 300,000 EVs by 2025. We have a governor that's supporting. Everybody is moving in the same direction, regardless of what side of the aisle they stand on. It seems like everybody still has that North Star of wanting electrification. Maybe they have different thoughts about the policies to get there or how much of it, but everybody knows that that's the place we want to get to, and including our commission, who's been very supportive. And they challenge us as well, because they're looking out for ratepayers' interest in the costs. And so we've had to get creative too in terms of bringing solutions that are going to keep costs manageable for ratepayers, and maybe are going to drive value to more value to ratepayers in the future. So that's really the secret sauce, and some of it is luck of the draw in terms of what environment are you in, regulatory environment are you in. And then the last part I think you asked about was what role should utility companies and charging companies play. I think we talked a lot about that. And speaking from the utility perspective, Iman's already talked about the grid management. So I'll talk to education. Equity is certainly a role that we can play. Early adoption is certainly a role that we can help in. And then the one that for this discussion, infrastructure, that I think is important, is that we can streamline processes. And we've gotten to see firsthand, but because the commission allowed us to start building chargers ourselves, we've gotten to see the pain points of charging companies like Electrify America and ChargePoint firsthand, because my team's going through it itself within the utility, right? Because we're dealing with the interconnection process. You don't get to see that until you walk a mile in someone's shoes, necessarily in the same way. And so by doing that, we're able to recognize the pain points and address some of those issues ahead of time, so that as these plans build out for these network companies, hopefully it's easier for them to execute on plans that they have.
That is very helpful to hear. And I also think that commissions across the country have learned lessons from smart grid deployments. I know at the beginning, utilities would come up with all these big investment plans, and if the commissions didn't feel comfortable, they would kind of deny and reject the entire plan. So I feel like the approach to electrification investments is it's more modular. The commissions seem to be approving, okay, here's 10 million, just go do it and then come back, show us how effective your policies or your investments have been. You've been serving underserved communities, just show us the impacts, and now we'll approve the next increment. So it sounds like that might have been a good sort of middle way, and certainly better than not giving utilities any role to play in this important endeavor. Okay, so I think this brings me to my sort of last formal question, and I will open it up for a broader discussion. I know we've been talking about the coordination and communication and what's worked, what hasn't, but given that I have two really important stakeholders from this ecosystem, electric utilities and the private investors and charging companies, I would like to ask you all, to utility folks, what is one thing that charging companies wanting? I'm asking for one thing. What is one thing that charging companies can do better to help you advance in your infrastructure investment plans and initiatives? And I'm also going to pose the same question to Robert and Anthony. What is one thing that utilities can do better so that we have less friction, more support in your infrastructure plans? So let's do Anthony, Iman, Devesh, and Robert this time.
I get to go first. So I'll probably piggyback on the previous discussion and question, and I will say rate design. I will say, being not just innovative, but utilities being able to look at what this truly is, which is transportation fuel, and being able to look at, using even the constructs that we have today. We're talking about cost-based rate making. Well, the challenge with that is the commercial rates that include demand charges today were never designed for fueling of vehicles, right? They were designed for building load and other use cases. And so I would say that would be one of the biggest areas where utilities across the board can continue to innovate, and the ones that are already looking at this. But obviously, as Robert even alluded to, there's a lot of utilities that haven't taken a look at this yet, and their role in the overall electrification process and what that means to the long-term success of what we're doing. I think that creating rate structures, rate classes, the whole gamut of what's going to be needed across the board for transportation fuel now that is going to be electricity, is going to be one of the biggest things that will lead to the success across the board for all of our companies.
Thank you. Iman?
With that, I would say it's probably the overall roadmap in terms of that managed charging infrastructure. With that, I think that's just going to continue to be, and I get the perspective is the rate design. That is for sure. I think I used the word fuel earlier. So I think a lot of people are aligned on this, is that we are going to be fueling up, customers' vehicles itself. But with that, we've got to be able to know the state of charge on those vehicles, be able to know where we need to go and fuel them up to. And then that roadmap that we're going to have with the charging companies and the OEMs, I know there's going to be a lot of coordination, but I think understanding, hey, where we're at currently, where we're going to be at in 2 years, where we're going to be at in 3, 5, etc. That way we can also bring other people within our utilities up to speed and get them sort of on board to the process. I think that's going to really help overall, and that's sort of what I see. That's always just one perspective, of course, right? But a little bit of a, kind of inside baseball on that one. But there you go.
So my one thing, I think, Anthony and Robert, for you, since this is my ability to have a soapbox in front of you, it's multi-unit dwellings, and it's a hard market to crack. Completely understand that, and it's going to take all of us working together. But there's so much that the network companies have in terms of access to those customers in order to improve that potentially. And a rising tide lifts all boats, right? And accessing all of those folks that live in multi-unit dwellings, not just apartments and condos, but townhomes and other places that don't necessarily have garages. Whatever you can do in that space.
And since Anthony already picked on rates, so I won't go there. I'll pick a different one. I would say for us it's speed. We're on a tear and have been for the last 3 years, and we have time commitments in our investment cycles that we need to meet and make happen. And there's been a lot of territories where the utility just wasn't moving fast enough, and so we said we're not going to invest there, and went just jump the utility line to the next utility, and they have better processes and more attention, and that's where we're going to invest. So it has a lot to do with how we decide where we're going to invest, where we think we can get the infrastructure in the ground, as well as all the other factors. So speed is very important. It's happening fast, and I think now that you're seeing a lot of more investment coming into the space, it's the problem's only going to get worse for utilities, right? We're not going away. There's more of us coming, and a lot more infrastructure, and a lot of different people investing, a lot of smaller groups, big groups like us. So it's going to be a big challenge, and the expectation is going to be get this done in days and weeks, not months and years. So that's the big one for me.
No, this has been great. Thank you, and clearly highlights the importance of ongoing communication and coordination going forward. Like you said, Robert, that the problem will only get complicated, so that calls for more communication and coordination. So I want to open the panel up to questions from our audience. And I think that there are a few questions about V2G, vehicle to grid, and it's a really interesting area. But I personally think that we're still trying to figure out how to charge these cars, and then yet I'm interested in too, but like industry is interested in sending this charge back to the grid. And what do you guys think about V2G? Are we there yet? Are we just trying to scratch the surface? I know that there are some demonstrations, but again, any takers from my panel to talk about the state of V2G.
I'm happy to give it a first crack. I think that anytime the question around V2G comes up, I always want to bring it back to what are we solving for, right? So if you look at from a grid standpoint, it's agnostic to the source of what's providing the grid service, whether it's a stationary battery, it's a battery with wheels, you know, any one of those things, the grid and from the management perspective doesn't care what's providing it. So then you look at the opportunity cost of providing the grid service, and specifically we're talking about exporting energy back onto the grid, right? And the barriers that you have to solve for to get there. And I think that it's one of these things that and it's very Silicon Valley, even from the charge point perspective, to get very excited about what the technology can do versus, you know, what is the most cost-effective way to get there and to deliver it. So I think that there will be applications for V2G. I think that there is already demonstrations, but it takes really close collaboration. Number one, on the OEM side, right? The vehicles have to be enabled, right? You have to take a look at the, you know, making it a process where you're going to have bidirectional capabilities on the vehicle, on the charger, and then ultimately what you have to have in place, because anytime you're going to be providing grid service from a distributed energy resource, is there has to be an economic value to do so. So, you know, having my background coming, especially from, you know, the other forms of DERs, and you compare it, if I'm procuring, whether it's utility or if I'm just looking at a wholesale market, right? If I'm procuring contracted services for you know, exported energy, and I look at the opportunity cost of a stationary battery doing it versus a vehicle where there's a huge risk factor in whether or not that vehicle is going to unplug and drive away, or an aggregation of those, and to do it, I think there's not enough conversation people usually have around the actual, you know, economic value to produce that exported kilowatt hour or exported kilowatt versus, you know, where you can get it elsewhere. And I think that's the design of our energy markets. I think competition is going to come in and you know, set the tone for where V2G is going to be valuable. I don't see technology as being the barrier. I don't know that, you know, we're not obviously widespread there. I think the technology can perform it. I think it's going to be whether or not it's actually valuable to come from vehicles is going to be the ultimate question.
Yeah, I would say similarly, right? The geek in me is really excited about V2G and what the capabilities could be, and we certainly have our own demonstrations that are underway. But when you start thinking about it practically, I think it's going to depend regionally as well, right? California does have a renewables challenge that they have to meet in terms of balancing the grid. We don't have that kind of penetration in much of the Mid-Atlantic, particularly in our part of Central Maryland yet. So it's not an issue for us yet where we need to find these solutions and incentivize those solutions necessarily yet. That said, there are narrow applications where it may make sense. You know, Anthony's right. There's a question about, is that battery going to be there for a personal vehicle that you might want to try to call on? Well, maybe not. But a school bus, right? School buses certainly do have a lot of there's an attraction there, because you can take a very large battery pack, roll it to a particular part of the grid, and that school bus doesn't have another use during those times of the day, right? Particularly during the summer when, you know, the system might be particularly strained. So you have more surety around it. It's a larger battery pack. It has a very particular solution for a very particular problem. So I think the potential is there. I'm really excited about it, but we're probably a little ways off from consumer V2G really taking off.
The one thing I'll add is, you know, I think already with stationary storage and the deployment of stationary storage, we see a lot of distributed energy out there that we could leverage. So to me, we really got to start working on the market rules for any device, whether it's a battery in a car or something that's just sitting on the ground. It's behind a meter. It's behind a retail meter. So how does that storage play into the wholesale market versus the retail market? And setting up those rules, right? So we're deploying 120, you know, energy storage devices at a lot of our stations. It's behind our meter, but we can't, like in CAISO, we can't participate, or it can't participate effectively on the wholesale market because of metering requirements and all these other sort of extraneous factors. So there's a lot we can do to kind of set ourselves up for V2G. So when we figure out the car thing and all these other communication issues and things like that, just setting up the basic market rules can be done now with stationary storage, both in the residential space as well as the sort of commercial industrial space, to make this a reality sooner than later.
Yeah, and
So
I think on that, sorry, just even one thing. So I think Order 2222 can facilitate perhaps development of those market rules while the technology is being proven. And like Devesh said, it will perhaps start as individual use cases, and once we have better understanding of those use cases through school buses and you know, perhaps even sometimes other fleet vehicles, and we can move on to the passenger vehicles. By the time it's interoperability and market rules hopefully will be there. Back to you, Eamon.
Yeah, something interesting that I've thought about for years is on the V2G technology and discharging is already right now we're trying to get EV chargers into customers' hands at the residential level, right? And also do that at the business level to provide the rebate incentive to go and have businesses do that there. So part of it's going to be an infrastructure issue when we're discharging off of the vehicle itself, is you're going to have the right equipment, whether it's in a residential capacity or whether that's you know, in a commercial or business capacity, to go and take that load off of the vehicle. So I think, you know, it always comes down to, again, the cost of infrastructure. It's hard. You know, honestly, personally, I love the idea of V2G technology. I mean, I think you're going to have all these large rolling battery packs. I mean, you're only going to see larger and larger battery packs. You look at all the other larger utility vehicles that are coming out. I mean, you have a tremendous amount of stored potential energy that's in there. And then you're going to have, of course, the ability also for some of the recycling potential of those vehicles once, you know, the batteries may not be suitable for, you know, EVs themselves, but then you could maybe take those battery packs and then do a discharge program with that. There's a lot of different things I think coming along too, is the automation. Once you get to some autonomous driving, is, you know, it got hinted at with the buses, right? You could have those vehicles with autonomous driving, you know, 5-10 years, whenever that comes around, move to where they need to be, right? You're not going to have pay a driver to go and do so. So there's some pretty neat things coming along, but a lot of it just comes down to that infrastructure cost initially, right? So, yeah.
Thank you. So we have a question about how the ratio of public chargers at level 2 versus DCFC is expected to evolve as the penetration levels increase.
I could take, at least from the public standpoint, I think what we see is a lot more DCFC, DC fast charging taking hold, only because, right, if you're on the public out and about, you're looking for a quick charge, you're looking to you know, get what you need in a few minutes and get going. We see obviously the proliferation of L2 for residential and for, you know, longer dwell type of locations like a workplace or other type of venues in that sense. I think there's just not a lot. It's more of like an opportunity. You know, public L2 is more of an opportunity. If it's there and it happens to be in the same place I'm going, then great. But I'm not really going to depend on it necessarily as much as I would maybe a workplace or residential or multifamily type of location. That's my view, but happy to hear what everybody else has to say.
Okay, so let's take another one. So there is a question about, you know, we talked about the roles of utilities and private charging companies, but how about major car manufacturers? What do we need them to do? Maybe you can give us your one thing that OEMs can do better to help move this forward.
I mean, I can start on that. certainly one of the things they can do better is dealer education, so that there's better consumer education at those dealerships. And we're still seeing consumers that are very frustrated when they go, in terms of their experience, when they go to a dealership. And oftentimes dealers aren't either comfortable or wanting to sell the electric vehicles. So that's a challenge, and certainly the dealership is a little separate from the OEMs, but they've got to do a better job coordinating that, and that's one place. And then the other, I would say, Iman touched on, which was giving access to those vehicle telematics in a way that's open and easy for the utilities, for the charging companies, for everyone, so that we can do the best job possible of managing that load.
I'll just add in my one main thing, and I'm actually surprised that it hasn't come up yet as we talked about the ubiquity of charging infrastructure, is standardization around a fast charging plug. We have still 3 different predominant ones in North America that we use. From the infrastructure provider standpoint, Robert and I both know this, you have to build to be able to support as many of the vehicles that are out there as possible, which means from a manufacturing perspective, there's added cost because you're putting at least 2 or 3 different types of ports on your publicly available fast charger. And I think that moving to a single common standard for North America is going to be incredibly important for public charging infrastructure. And then, where I think that we're hopefully seeing some alignment is in the medium and heavy duty space, where just a couple of years ago, the amount of vehicles that had proprietary charging ports, where, if you're a transit agency and you're investing in electric buses and the port on the bus is only made by the company that sold you the bus, that is not a recipe for scaling. And so I think, thankfully, we're seeing some alignment there from the medium and heavy duty manufacturers, and I hope that trend continues and we see ubiquity around the charging plugs across the board. I think that's going to lower the cost of infrastructure. It certainly lowers the manufacturer burden, and I think that makes sure that every single publicly available charging site that you would go to, as you drive up, that there's going to be a plug available that can charge your car.
I would just add to the charger standardization, if the OEMs could all decide to put the port in the same place on the car, that would be fantastic too. So that might be asking too much though.
Yeah, I hope some OEMs are listening to this conversation. We'll make sure they hear.
To piggyback in a related issue, that's something that's interesting. It'd be nice to see any of the DC fast charging infrastructure be a pull-through. So that way, as the technology continues to advance, as the vehicles are better able to take the charge, there's been a couple of conferences that I've attended like this, where the discussion of pull-through technology is going to be really important. So that way we can try to, make it a little bit faster, so that way people aren't having to back in, back out, but also be in a capacity to where hopefully as the charging gets there, they can do that. But also vehicles with trailers. I know that I think it's BC Canada was talking about that they saw some people with Model X's, a large component of them were pulling small travel trailers. So it's a little thing, but just one of those things that's out there that the do DC fast charging infrastructure do pull throughs. So.
Thank you. So we have a question about, given the steadily increasing battery sizes, are vehicle manufacturers going to discontinue level 1 charging? Any opinions on that? And I think level 1 charging is still the prevalent medium of charging, if I'm correct. So what are the trends there?
I think it's an interesting question. If you had a robust DCFC network that's sort of ubiquitous, like you keep talking about, across the territory, and your daily driving patterns are, less than 40 miles, that's easily replenished through a level 1 overnight. And then if you need to do that longer road trip or need more range, again, your vehicle, we're talking about cars that have 200 plus, 300 plus miles of range. So, I'm not sure you maybe see it go away. I think it depends on how the ecosystem around that particular consumer evolves and grows. But But I generally think if you have a solid DCFC infrastructure in that community, the need for potential to make the investment to a level 2 becomes less, and you could get away with the level 1. And then it just becomes a consumer preference in terms of, do they want that bell and whistle in their house, in terms of faster charging and more connectivity, and maybe some of the other things. But yeah, it's an interesting use case, and I don't see it going away anytime soon, for sure.
Okay.
I would say that's one of the factors that we considered when we were thinking about tapping into vehicle telematics instead of the smart chargers. Because even if at level 1 charging continues at a relatively high rate, we still want to be able to manage that in case there's a need to do so on the system. And we can do that if we're tapping into the telematics instead of only the data from smart chargers. So we still see it continuing. You're right. There's some benefit that we see in more consumers moving to level 2 charging, but it's also not a necessity for all customers, as Robert pointed out.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you. And I think we have time for one more question. The question is there a perceived conflict of interest in dealerships, given that they receive a large portion of revenue from servicing ICE vehicles? EVs don't have those maintenance items. So is that one of the big barriers that dealers don't want to sell EVs?
I mean, I'm happy to offer an opinion. I know that that's one of the points that folks bring up, and in the media and things like that. But I think a large part of it is just making sure that salespeople are educated about the technology and about the vehicles themselves, right? And you see this in every kind of selling marketplace. If a salesperson doesn't know the product they're selling, or knows one product better than the other, they're going to sell that other product, because they want to sell what they know that they know how to sell.
Yeah, I would agree. Having bought two EVs so far myself from 2 different automobile manufacturers and 2 different dealership experience. In both cases, I don't know. I can't speak to the business model of the dealerships and whether or not they're actively trying to push consumers away because of what they see as service revenue. I think that in most cases, unless you're buying a Tesla, you're walking onto a dealership where the EVs make up such a minute proportion of the overall vehicles on the lot, and make up such a small percentage of what individual salespeople transact every day. And so I think the challenges in my own anecdotal experience was coming in. I of course knew way more about the vehicle that I was wanting to purchase than the salesperson did, and I think that's probably the biggest primary challenge, is just not having a motivated and educated sales force that would comfortably respond to that. But then we have, on the flip side, we see when you do have dealerships that lean into this, when you do have proactive initiatives to educate, and you hear these great stories out of certain markets in the country where they sell more Nissan Leafs than entire states in some places. I think that there's use cases where you can see that. I don't think in the long term that's going to be something that dealerships are just going to be a barrier. I just think that it's about scale and how much ultimately revenue that they think that they can get through EV vehicle sales.
And I'll just add finally, I mean, electrification of transportation is it's destructive in some sense, right? And it's going to kind of break old business models and ways of doing things, and have to, they'll have to create themselves into something different, or make tweaks here and there. And that goes for utilities, it goes for companies like us, it goes for automakers, it goes for everybody in the value chain. And so I don't know exactly what the answer is and what it'll look like in the future, but something new will be created, a new way of doing things will be created, a new way to extract value for these proprietors of dealerships and things like that will emerge. And it'll look different, but it'll be an evolution, and continue to happen. So I'm not too worried. It's just the natural evolution of disruptive technology as it enters the market.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I personally think this has been a great discussion. Thank you all so much for sharing your experiences and your work and advancing the state of transportation electrification. With that, let me turn it over to Danielle.